All right, we are going to go through the Chapter 11 notes, Part 1, which is Anatomy and Physiology of the Heart. You guys are at clinical, so let's see if you interrupt my recording. Okay, so the cardiovascular system. I'm going to see if laser pointer so you can see it. Cardiovascular system. What does cardio mean? Heart. Vascular is blood vessels. Together they make the cardiovascular system. So you've got the heart that is the pump that is creating the force that is going to move what I call the soccer mom or the soccer mom van or the blood around the body. And then your blood vessels are going to be like the highway system that the soccer mom van or blood moves around the body. And why do we have to move blood around? Because it's going to be carrying oxygen, waste, hormones, proteins, nutrients all around and getting them to our tissue cells. And so here we have the heart. Your heart sits pretty much in the center of your chest, maybe slightly left of center, in a cavity called the mediastinum. Okay, and your heart, which I have right here, is kind of like an upside down triangle. So it's a little flattened at the top and pointy at the bottom. And so we call the top the base and the bottom the apex. And so it sits in that just left of center in that cavity called the mediastinum, just like this. Okay, so I think one of the hardest things with the heart is understanding that when you're looking at a heart on a screen, you're looking at a patient's heart, okay? And so this will be the right side and this will be the left side. And I think that could be one of the most challenging things. So when we cut the heart in half or do a frontal cut and look at the heart like this, okay? Over here, we have the right side of the heart, we have the right atrium and the right ventricle. And then on the other side, we have the left atrium and the left ventricle. And this is showing you the path of blood. So where you see blue is indicating that we have oxygen poor or deoxygenated blood. And the vessels that you're seeing red, that would be oxygenated or oxygen rich blood. And so the inferior vena cava, which we see here, and the superior vena cava are returning oxygen poor blood back to the heart via the right atrium. It will then go through a valve here, which is called the tricuspid valve, to the right ventricle, and then will then get pumped through the pulmonary artery to our blood through the pulmonary arteries, to the left and right lung, where CO2 is going to get dumped off, oxygen is going to get picked up. That oxygenated blood is then going to come back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. So we've got right and we've got left pulmonary veins. They're behind the heart here, where they're going to dump their oxygen-rich blood into the left atrium, which then goes through a valve, which is called the bicuspid or mitral valve, through the left atrium, and then pumped behind here through the aorta, which is then going to pump blood to the rest of the body. So your heart is a double pump. You've got the right side that's dealing with the pulmonary circuit and the left side that's dealing with the systemic circuit. And if we look at this cross section of the heart here, we can see that here is the septum. So the septum is the structure, it's like getting a septum piercing. It's going to divide your heart into right and left halves. And this is showing the heart wall. And as you can see, the wall, specifically the myocardium, which is the middle muscle layer of the heart wall, is much thicker in the left ventricle than it is in the right ventricle or really anywhere else in the heart. Why? Because the left ventricle has to create the force to pump blood throughout your entire systemic circuit and back to the body. The right ventricle is creating the force to pump blood to the lungs and back. So this is talking about the protective layers on the outside of the heart. So the heart wall itself has 3 layers, and then we have pericardium on the outside of that, but we have 2 layers of pericardium. And so there are 5 total layers that you're going to need to know. Let's see here. So this is looking at a cross section of the heart itself. This would be deep. This would be superficial. So I'm going to start actually from deep to superficial. So the innermost layer of the heart, so like blood would be right here, would be the endocardium. So endo meaning on the inside. That is made out of endothelial cells. Nice, smooth, frictionless surface. The bulk of the heart wall is going to be myocardium. What does that prefix mean? Myo, you guessed it, muscle. And this is going to be cardiac muscle tissue, which is not found anywhere else in the body, just in the heart. So this is our dominant tissue type. When we get out here, okay, this is the outer layer of the heart wall proper, and it is called the epicardium. Okay, so you can see that down here. I know you can't see it very well. That's the epicardium. However, the epicardium is also the inner layer of the serous pericardium. If you remember from chapter 4, we talked about serous membranes. Serous membranes are double layers. They have an outer layer and an inner layer, and it's one membrane folded over itself. That outer one is called parietal. That inner is called visceral. And so the epicardium has another name, and that is visceral pericardium. So that would be, this yellowish looking tan thing right here. And then here, this blue would be the outer part of the serous membrane, which would be the parietal pericardium. So the visceral and the parietal pericardium make up the serous pericardium. That's a fluid producing membrane that's going to keep friction down as the heart can move against itself. And then on the outside here is the fibrous pericardium. And to me, I think about that's like the ugly Amazon box on the outside. That's there for kind of rough protection. So this is showing serous membranes around the lungs and around the heart. And so if we look at this heart right here, the blue is showing the epicardium, aka serous pericardium in the inner layer, which is the visceral pericardium, and then the green would be showing the outer part of the serous pericardium, which is the parietal pericardium. And then we have this serous space or pericardial space in here, which could potentially be a potential space for things to accumulate like fluid. And these are the layers of the heart wall proper, endocardium being the innermost layer, myocardium being the cardiac muscle tissue, the dominant tissue type, and then the epicardium, aka visceral pericardium, is the outermost layer secreting lubricating fluid. And that's just another picture of the walls of the heart and its different layers. Okay, so the heart has 4 chambers. I know everybody loves when I draw. So if I draw a heart over here, this is not anatomically accurate. So here's the heart. We've got 4 chambers, and our top 2 chambers are going to be the atria, and that's supposed to be an A, and then our bottom 2 are going to be ventricles. And as a reminder, this is the right side of the heart, and this is the left side of the heart. The atria are kind of like little cups. They're just there to collect blood and send it down to the ventricles. The ventricles are really the pumps that are going to be pumping blood either to the lungs and back or to the entire body and back. So in this picture, it's not really color coordinated to see if things are, oxygenated or deoxygenated. But again, superior, inferior vena cava are going to be bringing blood from the right atrium through this atrioventricular valve, which is specifically called the tricuspid valve on the right side, to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's going to get pumped to the lungs because CO2's got to get dumped, O2's got to get picked up. It's going to go through another valve, which is a semilunar valve, and specifically on the right side, it is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. That's because this is the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery is going to separate into right and left pulmonary artery, so this is going to go to the lungs. At the lungs, gas exchange is going to occur. That is external respiration. That's we're going to be learning about that in chapter 13. And then oxygen-rich blood is going to come back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. Arteries are always going away from the heart. Veins are always returning to the heart. So oxygen-rich blood is going to go to the left atrium, then through this valve on the right side. So this is another atrioventricular valve between the atria and the ventricles. And on the left side, it's going to be called the mitral valve. So left atrium, mitral valve, left ventricle. Then the left ventricle is going to create the force to pump it up through this valve, which is the left semilunar valve, which we call the aortic valve, because why? The aorta is right here. So left ventricle going to the aorta. The aorta is going to kind of come up spin around. We have some branches that are going to be feeding the chest, the head, and the neck. And then this is going to turn, this is called the aortic arch. And then it's going to turn into the descending aorta and then keep going down and become the abdominal aorta. And it's like a tree trunk. And you're going to have all of these branches coming off that are going to serve our organs. So this is just a little more in detail graphic of the heart here, showing our right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. These are the valves. The valves are actually held in place by these things. They're called chordae tendineae. They're your heartstrings, okay? And so the valves, so if here was the atria, and here were the ventricle. The valves are going to flop down until the ventricles close, and then they close like this. So ventricles fill up, push them close. Ventricles fill up, push them close. What these heartstrings or chordae tendineae prevent is the valves going back up like this and then having regurgitation or reflux of blood going backwards. So again, let's trace the path of blood. Right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle, pulmonary semilunar valve, pulmonary artery, unique pulmonary artery here in that it is oxygen poor blood. Oftentimes arteries have oxygen rich blood. This isn't the case here. It's going to split into left, right pulmonary arteries. They're going to go off to the lungs, do gas exchange. Now we're going to come back. Now we have pulmonary veins, left pulmonary veins, right pulmonary veins. You can see over here, going to bring that oxygen-rich blood back to the left atrium through the mitral valve, also known as the bicuspid valve. The tricuspid valve has 3 flaps. The bicuspid has 2, but because they sound similar, we just say tricuspid and mitral. So mitral valve, left ventricle, through the aortic valve, and then out through the aorta. So as I mentioned earlier, the heart is a double pump. There is a pulmonary circuit, which goes to the lungs and back, systemic circuit that goes to the rest of the body and back. The pulmonary circuit is going to be right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle, pulmonary artery to the lungs and back. And then the systemic circuit is going to be left atrium, mitral valve, left ventricle, aorta to the rest of the body and back. And from the aorta, there's going to be splits into smaller vessels called arteries, and then even smaller vessels that are called arterioles. Then we're going to get to 1 cell layer thick vessels that are called capillaries. And then from the capillaries, we're going to make our way back to the heart and go from capillaries to smaller veins, which are called venules, veins, and then we're going to dump our blood into the megaveins, which are the superior and inferior vena cava. So this is obviously a very simplified version of, showing the pulmonary circuit and then the systemic circuit. Valves, we've really talked about these. So valves are preventing backflow of blood. They're making sure blood goes in one direction forward, if you will. We have atrioventricular valves that are in between the atria and the ventricle, and they're called the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve. And then we have semilunar valves, which are between the ventricles and the major arteries that they pump their blood out into. And so the right ventricle is pumping its blood into the pulmonary artery, and we call that the pulmonary semilunar valve in between. And the left ventricle is pumping its blood into the aorta through the aortic semilunar valve. Okay, so here would be our tricuspid. See, we have 3 flaps. Bicuspid or mitral valve has 2 flaps. And then here we have our semilunar valves. To me, they look like pie cut into 3 equal pieces. So the aortic valve would be on the left side, pulmonary valve would be on the right. So the heart itself has its own circulatory pathway. So one of the first branches off of the aorta is actually to the coronary sinus, which is going to feed blood to the heart itself via via the coronary vessels. Okay, so the vessels you see on the outside of the heart are the coronary vessels. These are the vessels that, if they get occluded or blocked, will cause a heart attack or a myocardial infarction. So off of the aorta, right here, you're going to have a couple branches. One is to the right coronary artery, which is going to feed the right side of the heart. And then behind number 5 here, we see what's called, or it is number 5, which is behind the pulmonary artery, excuse me, is the left main coronary artery. The left main coronary artery is going to feed another coronary vessel, which is called the LAD, or the left anterior descending. And number 4 here, which is the circumflex. If the left main coronary artery becomes blocked, you actually have the LAD that is blocked and the circumflex that is blocked. The left anterior descending artery feeds blood to the entire left side of the heart. Okay? Let's see. Left side, here we go. It's got to be on me, the patient, the whole left side of the heart. All right. That's a big deal because that is responsible for the systemic pump. So pumping blood to the, the whole body and back. And so if the left main coronary artery goes down, that means that the whole heart, could stop functioning and getting blood to the rest of the body. So an occlusion or a blockage in the left main coronary artery is often called the widowmaker. When people are dropping dead from a heart attack, oftentimes it's because of an occlusion of the left main coronary artery. So this just talks about, due to the oxygen deprivation, that's where people get that chest pain called angina pectoris. So if you think about if you're running up some flights of stairs, your leg muscles start to get sore. Why? Because they're hypoxic. Okay, they've run out of oxygen, and so that's the same thing that's going to happen to the heart muscle that causes that blockage or that infarct, which can lead to that myocardial infarction. So the myocardium is not getting the oxygen that it needs in order to cause those cells to contract. Okay, I'm going to keep going, I think, because nobody's coming back. So we have about 5 to 6 liters of blood, or the soccer mom van, in our body, and that gets pumped through our heart pumps that about 1,000 times a day. So your heart is pumping about 6,000 liters. That's pretty crazy. And the pumping action of the heart is actually coordinated by something called the intrinsic conduction system. Your heart literally beats to its own drum. We have these specialized cells called autorhythmic cells that make the intrinsic conduction system. And these cells will depolarize all on their own. And we learned about in chapter 6 and chapter 7, depolarization of a plasma membrane leads to muscle contraction. So this nodal system is made out of some specialized myocardial cells that actually depolarize all on their own. And you have, they're not physically connected to each other, but you've got one up in the, let's go to a picture of it. You've got one here kind of near the atria, one that's a little further down, and then some stuff that's going through the ventricles here. And the ventricles, because they have a lot of myocardium, they would actually naturally depolarize like 20 to 40 times per minute. And the atria, because they're smaller, they have less myocardium, they would actually want to depolarize like 60 to 70 times a minute. Well, if the atria are like this, trying to depolarize and contract, and the ventricles are kind of contracting like this, I can't do it. It's like trying to do this at the same time. They're out of sync with each other, and that's not going to produce a functional, heart as far as pumping blood, and that's called fibrillation. That's when we would shock the heart when, the atria and the ventricles are kind of out of sync with each other. But what happens is that we actually have this intrinsic conduction system that coordinates the contractions. So this atria ventricles, atria ventricles, atria ventricles, atria ventricles for contraction. And so the piece of the intrinsic conduction system that sets the rate, we talk about in class how you have that person in like a crew boat that's saying stroke, stroke, stroke. Okay, that's setting the rate for people in that crew boat to be rowing, so that everybody's going together, so that the once they're in unison, everything can work most effectively. That's the sinoatrial node, or the pacemaker. That's setting the rhythm or the rate and causing a depolarization wave, so that it goes depolarization of this stuff and then everything else, and then this stuff and then everything else, this stuff and then everything else. Okay, so the SA node is called the pacemaker, and that sets the rate. That's that person saying stroke, 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 okay, in a crew boat. So the wave starts here of depolarization. Depolarization leads to contraction. So when the SA node starts to depolarize, that is going to lead to atrial depolarization, which leads to atrial contraction. And then we're going to get it down to what's called the AV node or the atrioventricular node. That is going to start the depolarization of the ventricles. And again, depolarization leads to contraction. Then we're going to have the ventricles contract. This is called the bundle of His. Then we have the right and left bundle branches, and then we have Purkinje fibers when we get down here. There's a lot more myocardium in the ventricles to have to stimulate to contract than there are in the atria. So what do we see because of this intrinsic conduction system? We see the EKG wave, and these things, so from here to here, okay, is one heart cycle, okay? And these little bumps actually mean something. What do they mean? Well, this is called a P wave, right over here. It's not labeled on here. Here we go. So this is one complete heart cycle. And so we have this wave. That actually is standing for atrial depolarization, which leads to atrial contraction. Then we have a structure called the QRS. That is showing actually two things, but only one is mentioned here. So the ventricles, as I mentioned, are much larger than the atria. So the ventricular depolarization is going to look much more significant electrically. But what also happens here, in order for a contraction to happen again, we have to have relaxation and we also have to have repolarization. So during the QRS segment, we also have atrial repolarization. And then finally, the third bump here is the T wave, and that is showing ventricular repolarization. So if they do an EKG and they're looking at, different areas of the heart, they can look at this EKG strip and see if there are any abnormalities, and that could mean something significant going on in the heart. So they can look at the distance between heartbeats. Is it normal? Is it tachycardic? Is it bradycardic? Are they regular? Are they irregularly coming? And then, somebody who's a cardiologist, not me, can look at actually different segments and break these things down. And they can mean different things, but the atria are doing or do something or not doing something that they're supposed to be doing. So here would be a relatively normal EKG, ECG used interchangeably, by the way, and they're, a little more abnormal EKG down here. That's it. Right.